Okay.
Just push it, and you don't have to hold it down.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. It's nice to see so many familiar faces in the room. As you all did, as we did here at Stimson, we lived through a watershed moment last July when 122 countries agreed and voiced support for the so-called ban treaty. After 50 of those states ratified the agreement, the 90-day clock will start, and that agreement will enter into force. So we thought that this may be a propitious moment to really step back and do what I think Stimson does best, along with our partners, the Washington Foreign Law Society. As some of you may know, this is a semi-regular series that we do with the Washington Foreign Law Society, where we try to put politics aside and we really try to just study the facts. And to do that, we have assembled what I hope you will agree is really a blockbuster panel to lead us in a discussion of the broader implications of the treaty. What are the legal implications, particularly given that, as you know, the nuclear weapon states have decidedly not voiced their support for the agreement. As I say, we have assembled for you, thanks to the good offices of my colleague Deborah Decker here at Stimson, really a blockbuster panel for us. She's going to introduce the panel. We're particularly, of course, grateful, Ambassador Goodby, to you, Professor Payne, to you for joining us. But if I may, as just a personal aside, say that I am particularly pleased to welcome Mallory Stewart for her stage debut here at Stimson, having exited the State Department. Apparently they're having a bit of a retention problem at the State Department, and we are contributing to that problem here at Stimson, and we are pleased to be part of that problem, especially Mallory, in welcoming you to Stimson very formally and publicly, finally. And so with that, Deborah, maybe I will pass this to you. Deborah is a distinguished fellow and senior advisor. She directs much of our nuclear security work here at Stimson, and she is also a member of the board of the Washington Foreign Law Society. We thank you for bringing that partnership together, and I hand the stage to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Brian. This is on the record, and audience questions will be taken at the end of our panel discussion. But before we start, I wanted to show you a cartoon from one of my favorite shut it off now. Local cartoonist, Carlton Stoiber, who did this for us. And this is, I guess, kind of how the world has worked till now. What's the point of a treaty? But, and in addition to that, of course, we know that there's lots of points to it, much more than can be said by things such as, I like this July 17th Wall Street Journal article, editorial. The UN bans nuclear weapons. So at least that problem solved. Well, clearly that's not what has happened. There's a lot for us to consider now because there's great momentum behind what's happening, especially with the Nobel Peace Prize. There's greater legitimacy to the requests of all the states that are complaining that there hasn't been enough effect for non-proliferation, enough efforts going forward. So I didn't want to talk on this panel about the problems with the treaty. We know there are problems. And I do want to talk a little bit about that, but really, what should we do next? How can we use this period of time to go forward? What are some of the purposes of the treaty that may be achieved, not only in the end game, but getting there somehow? And that's the big question, somehow. So let me introduce our great panel. I'm so happy. So I'll start on the far right. You have their bios in your seats, their longer bios. Mallory Stewart is a non-resident fellow, and she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Emerging Security Challenges in Defense Policy in the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the U.S. State Department. As Brian says, we're so glad you're with us now. Ambassador James Goodby has a long and distinguished career. We're so glad that you're here. He was involved as a negotiator and policy advisor for the creation of, for the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So, and negotiated such things as START and the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and a long list of other things. His most recent book is Approaching the Nuclear Tipping Point, Cooperative Security in an Era of Global Change, which just came out. Thank you for being here. And then on my left is Professor Simi Payne. She's at Rutgers University and is has been legal counsel for the environmental damage reparation programs of the UN Compensation Commission, has had legal responsibility, has looked at the legal responsibility of aggressor states in arms conflicts, has been involved in the Nuclear Claims Tribunal of the Marshall Islands, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Court of Justice, and I can go on. Thank you so much for coming from Rutgers. Appreciate your trip. And then last but not least, Barry Blechman is not only currently a member of the board of the Stimson Center, but was co-founder of Stimson Center and has had a long career advising on nuclear and strategic military issues and serves on many boards and commissions and written quite a bit. And you can see their bios in your chair, so thank you all for coming. I wanted to start with Mallory, since you've done some recent writing on, put this forward. I hope people can read this, and I'll pass this to you. This is the right clicker here. I want you to since we haven't all read the treaty in detail, Mallory's a lawyer. She's read it in more detail than I have, and I've read it several times. So I wanted you to go through a little bit about what's in there and what are some of the points that you take away from this.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to be here with this distinguished panel. Recently, a colleague of mine, Newell Highsmith, and I started looking at this treaty from a legal perspective to see if it accomplished what it is intended to accomplish, if it could accomplish that, and what the parameters for its implementation would be. Deborah's asked me to start by speaking about some of the background, so I thought we would start with the provisions of the treaty, which I'm not sure if we can lower the lights a little bit or if people can see this, but I can walk through. To just start with some of the basic prohibitions. Clearly, the development, testing, production, manufacture, otherwise acquisition, the standard prohibitions on possessing or stockpiling nuclear weapons, transferring or receiving nuclear weapons. Then we move into using or threatening the use of nuclear weapons. And the fourth one is assisting, encouraging, or inducing in any way anyone to engage in activities prohibited to states parties to the treaty. Then we have seek or receive any assistance in any way from anyone and allow any stationing, installation, or deployment of nuclear weapons in their territory at any place under their jurisdiction or control. So the reason these additional elements, the fourth prohibition and the sixth prohibition, are so interesting is that they're taken in large part from other treaties that are comprehensive bans, such as the Chemical Weapons Convention or the landmines prohibitions, and they are poorly understood right now in terms of how do you prevent anyone from engaging in activities that are prohibited to state parties under this treaty when the NPT is out there allowing there to be nuclear weapon states. How will that play out? These are some of the questions these prohibitions raise. Now, allowing any stationing or installation or deployment is clearly aimed at some of the countries that this is hoping to influence that have agreements or at least cooperation with the nuclear weapon states for such stationing and deployment. So these prohibitions raise interesting questions that this treaty really needs to consider and how they're going to encourage these countries to join on, to actually adhere to these prohibitions in light of the NPT. Again, just providing the background now, I want to walk through this before we get into a more substantive conversation. The verification under this treaty. We have three different verification realms here. We have states that are non-nuclear weapon states, and they join without ever having been nuclear weapon states. Their obligations under the treaty are just to maintain their existing safeguards and enter into a comprehensive safeguards agreement if they don't already have one. What's glaringly absent in this first verification category is an additional protocol, a requirement to adhere to additional protocol. If there are nuclear weapon states that destroy their nuclear weapons and then join, they have a little more extensive verification requirements to cooperate with a soon or hopefully soon to be named competent international authority designated by the parties to negotiate and verify the irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons. They also must enter into the comprehensive safeguards, but also the additional protocol. so they have more extensive verification requirements, also somewhat unclear, first of all, who the competent international authority is, or if there ever will be one, and what it means to negotiate and verify the irreversible elimination. It is markedly different that they need to adhere to additional protocol, while the non-nuclear weapon states don't have such an obligation. We're going to discuss that in a few minutes. Finally, if there are any states who would be foolish enough to join and then destroy, they are subject to an extensive verification requirement that's fairly unclear. It has a lot of giving decision-making capacity over to others without really knowing the end game. Immediately remove from operational status and destroy, but not later than a deadline to be determined by the parties at their first meeting. And these are the non-nuclear weapon states parties, presumably, that don't feel that they should be subject to an additional protocol. Destruction pursuant to legally binding time-bound plan. Submit the plan, negotiate the plan, submit the plan to the parties. A lot of submitting to others' decision-making capacity, enter into the comprehensive safeguards, and of course, an additional protocol. I will note that clearly the additional protocol is an important element to the IAEA's arsenal to prevent the development of a clandestine nuclear program. The IAEA website itself explains that the additional protocol aims to fill the gaps in the information reported under the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement by enabling the IAEA to obtain a much fuller picture of such states' nuclear programs, plans, nuclear material holdings, and trade. The additional protocol increases the IAEA's ability to provide much greater assistance on the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in those states. Assurance, much greater assurance. So this is a verification regime that represents something that we're going to discuss next, which is a division between the trust that the treaty negotiators had for states without nuclear weapons and the trust they feel towards those states that have nuclear weapons and either join having destroyed or join and then destroy. There's Article 18 that is also important for our conversation because it signifies that the treaty negotiators intended this treaty to trump the NPT. I use that word intentionally. The implementation of this treaty shall not prejudice obligations undertaken by states parties with regard to existing international agreements to which they are party, where those obligations are consistent with this treaty. In other words, this treaty won't prejudice other obligations as long as those treaties are consistent with this treaty. The NPT allows states to have nuclear weapons. That's not consistent with this treaty. So let's think about this article because it's been inconsistently interpreted in my readings by the academic community. Some negotiators say, well, it doesn't really usurp anything or any power from the NPT so long as the NPT doesn't in any way conflict with this. Well, the NPT does conflict with this treaty. And I do want to talk about that more. So let's get to the heart of the concerns here. The nuclear ban treaty risks weakening the non-proliferation and nuclear security regimes in three ways, primarily. It subordinates the NPT under the article we just mentioned. It potentially undermines the safeguards regime, and we'll talk about that, and it could undermine the IAEA. So starting with the first point, because the ban treaty prevails over other treaties, it raises questions that I haven't seen fully answered, nor would you see consistent answers when answers are given. Can peaceful nuclear cooperation continue with nuclear weapon possessing states? What about cooperation on nuclear security? Does that violate the assist, encourage, induce provisions? Can a party participate in NATO's collective defense arrangements? We've seen the NATO countries raise this question. Can the NPT community implement additional or improved safeguards and nuclear security procedures if the ban treaty does not require them? Is there going to be a conflict when a ban treaty participant says, I'm complying with the ban treaty, I do not have to do these additional steps under the NPT? Is there an inconsistency, a later in time obligation for them that they can argue the ban treaty is now the relevant requirements that they need to fulfill? Could a state join the ban treaty instead of the NPT to avoid NPT procedures and oversight? These are all questions that aren't clearly answered at this point. Maybe some answers will come as this treaty rolls out and there's more clarity, but I would argue that the presence of this treaty potentially weakens the NPT, which is something that the preamble to this treaty recognized as an important treaty in the world of non-proliferation and nuclear security. It weakens it by asking the questions, by allowing countries to decide in a manner how they will interpret this treaty in light of the NPT. What if there are countries or companies that decide that nuclear security cooperation and non-proliferation cooperation isn't allowed under this new treaty? Does that diminish their NPT obligation? Does that allow one of the pillars of the NPT to go forward for peaceful use of nuclear weapons, nuclear power? How does this translate to the implementation of the NPT's pillars when these questions aren't clearly answered, nor does the existence of the ban treaty really explain how it can peacefully coexist with the NPT, which has requirements and recognition of rights for nuclear weapon states that are very different and are inconsistent with some of the ban treaty requirements.
There has to be good news somewhere here.
Yeah, we're going to go to good news, sorry. So undermining the safeguards regime. I do believe that the ban treaty's fatal flaw is failing to require the additional protocol for all states parties, for all countries. I think it represents a question in the sincerity of the proponent's desire to rid the world of nuclear weapons. We all appreciate the importance of the additional protocol, but not requiring the additional protocol opens a path to possible clandestine weapons development in states that do not currently have such an additional protocol, including 32 states by my count, including Algeria, Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Venezuela, and many others. By not including the additional protocol, the ban treaty forgets that without effective verification, there can be no unqualified elimination. There will always be doubts and a disparity in trust that actually will color the ability to implement the ban treaty by the competent international authority. And what about Iran? If there's no requirement for a safeguards regime in this treaty, does Iran get to say, we don't have to continue to implement provisionally in the additional protocol if the JCPOA goes away? It's a question, it's an open question. Finally, it could undermine the IAEA. Understanding the impetus for developing a competent international authority separate from the IAEA's realm of expertise, there is a concern, certainly, that this competent international authority would compete for resources, expertise. Certainly, there's a potential overlap of responsibilities, verification of peaceful programs versus confirmation of the irreversible elimination may overlap, as we've seen in countries in the past. A very big concern is that forum shopping could result, that countries will decide they don't like the decision of the IAEA and they will go to the competent international authority. And finally, as I mentioned in the last point, if the non-nuclear weapon states don't have additional protocol and they are going to allow their members to be on this competent international authority, is there a trust problem here when the nuclear weapon states are allowing access to their nuclear program information, some of the most sensitive information that they have, to these individuals that aren't subject to the same verification requirements? Is this setting up a disparity in trust? That your competent international authority, or even the states parties, because the treaty says if you can't get this competent international authority, the states parties to the treaty will take the relevant decisions. Can you trust these countries if they're subject to a different verification? All right, so Deborah has rightly pointed out, where do we go from here? I'm certainly not raising these points to bash the treaty with no forward path. Certainly when we reviewed this treaty, Newell Highsmith and I were looking for ways to possibly push the narrative forward in a productive way. We don't want this treaty to do harm to the existing NPT regime, but how do we sort of keep this conversation going in a productive way? So, potential path forward as I see it, though of course there's many potential paths forward in any context, but I do think it's useful to discuss the legal flaws. I don't think the absence of a requirement for additional protocol, the problems with some of the legal provisions in this treaty, including a withdrawal provision that we haven't even mentioned, that requires 12 months before an effective withdrawal can be done, and does not allow withdrawal if the party seeking to withdraw is in an active conflict. Who makes that decision? An active armed conflict. Who decides what is an active armed conflict, and how is that consistent with withdrawal for the supreme interests of the country? Right? If you're allowed to withdraw because it's in your national security concerns, and then you're prohibited from withdrawing for 12 months, or if you're in an active conflict, it's very inconsistent. These are legal issues that will prohibit nuclear weapon states, and even umbrella states potentially, from joining. They don't understand how these provisions work with the NPT, how they possibly could work with the NPT or with their national security. And I think the verification questions, the lack of common understandings about meanings and effects should be discussed and understood. There is an amendment process in this treaty. Whether it could effectively be achieved is another question. I think that is a legal conversation and a practical implication conversation for implementing this treaty that needs to happen and shouldn't be ignored by the nuclear weapon states and their allies. Diminish the divide. The treaty creates a rift in the nuclear nonproliferation community. It clearly says we trust ourselves as non-nuclear weapon states, and we don't trust the nuclear weapon states. We do not subject ourselves to the same level of verification requirements, but we will subject others. And we will usurp their decision-making capacity by sitting in judgment on what is verifiable elimination, when they have to eliminate it by, when they can even withdraw, if they are still in an active armed conflict. There's so many open questions that the states parties will take decisions on. And those states parties represent a community that has decided they generally do not need to have an additional protocol, and they have different standards for themselves. So I think diminishing the divide means focusing on areas of cooperation and collaboration. I'll throw out several, though certainly there's many more that need to be developed and thought about. But I do think having a nuclear security summit that brings together all of these countries and an IPNDV that can actually have 25 states right now, both nuclear and non-nuclear, working together for nuclear verification, disarmament verification. These are important collaboration efforts. There's areas of cooperation that we've yet to even try that could be focused on to actually, instead of dividing a community, bring a community together. Finally, understand where it is coming from. I think the most harmful thing that nuclear weapon states and their allies could do to this effort is to try to ignore the ban treaty and try to pretend that there isn't a true problem here. Right? Clearly, this is an issue that's been going for many years. It was a treaty that was negotiated very quickly with strong impetus. What could be done in understanding where it's coming from is highlighting what has been accomplished, try to focus on expanding the nuclear weapons free zones potentially, extending New START, starting a public dialogue in the P5 in response to the ban treaty, or even a more fulsome discussion of tactical nuclear weapons, trying to focus on things that could be accomplished, that have been accomplished, and saying we recognize the problem here. We recognize there's been a failure under the NPT to actually move forward productively on disarmament issues, but we have been taking steps to do so, and we're trying to do so. I think there needs to be forward progress in a community that comes together as a whole, and I know that's been mentioned in the past, but common discussions amongst all of the relevant parties to try to come to a realistic approach that will address the verification problems, address the security concerns, and hopefully move in a positive direction. I do want to say, in this day and age, as we've heard of recent testing by the DPRK, certainly the P5 pointed out when this treaty was signed that this is not the time to have this conversation. I think we need to figure out how we make it the time, right? Given that the Chemical Weapons Convention has been repeatedly violated with no consequences for Syria, state party, and no significant outcry beyond the United States and the P3, it's interesting that this community of nuclear ban supporters want to push forward another instrument of international law that has very difficult elements for implementation, enforcement, and verification. to have a glaring violation of an arms control treaty. One of the treaties that this ban treaty is based upon, to have its glaring violation and to have it being ignored by those countries that are pushing for the ban treaty, in my mind, is very problematic. So just to conclude, I do want to push this conversation forward and to see it push forward. I think all of us in this room and everyone in this community wants a world without nuclear weapons. But this treaty has some flaws that have to be discussed and understood, and hopefully there can be collaboration on how to improve the environment for pushing this conversation forward. Thank you.
I asked Mallory to start so that we would all have an idea of what all the negatives, or a lot of the negatives were, but offering some nice positives at the end for ways to move forward, so I appreciate that. I wanted to ask Barry now, because you've seen a lot in over 50 years of your work in this area, and I mean, what do you see? I mean, what are your impressions of the Nuke ban treaty? How can it move forward, and is it as negative as some people might say?
Well, I would disagree with that it's a negative step. My co-founder, Michael Crapon, kids me all the time that Stimson Center has been around for 30 years and we haven't yet gotten rid of nuclear weapons. But we do our best to at least reduce them and reduce, more importantly, the dangers. It seems self-evident to me that nuclear weapons should not only be banned, but in fact effectively eliminated. There's no greater threat to humanity, no greater threat in the near term, at least, than the existence of nuclear weapons, which at any moment, while we're sitting here, could lead to the destruction of much of humanity. So the first positive about the ban is it reinforces the taboo on nuclear weapons, and especially on their use. It grew, of course, out of the humanitarian conferences, and it emphasizes the catastrophic nature of any nuclear use, but certainly of any nuclear exchange. And perhaps some of the flaws in the treaty, and I would not disagree, I would agree that there are flaws in the treaty, might not be there if the U.S. and other countries had been willing to participate fully in these conferences and in the negotiations leading to the treaty. But the treaty does state clearly for the first time that these weapons are illegal and should be totally eliminated. And I think that's a real plus to have that statement out there. And once the treaty is, the more nations that ratify this treaty and adhere to that statement, the better off we'll be. I don't think it undermines the NPT. I think the NPT is being undermined by the nuclear weapon states. First of all, there are 4 nuclear weapon states that are not party to the NPT, as we all know. Secondly, there's been no progress toward implementing the NPT's commitment to move toward nuclear and more general disarmament, at least since 2000. The review conferences get worse and worse, and I think, Mallory, you're lucky not to be in the State Department for the upcoming one, which is likely to be quite a slugfest, I would guess. I mean, the threat posed by the handful of nuclear weapon states to the rest of humanity, it needs to be highlighted whenever possible, to my view. And as I say, there's been virtually zero progress since 2000, and we're in fact now moving backwards. I forget, was it in the 2010 conference, the 5 nuclear weapon states agreed to meet separately to begin discussing how they might move toward nuclear disarmament, and those meetings, of course, have produced virtually nothing, which is unfortunate. And we stand now on the cusp of what could well be a new round of nuclear proliferation, a renewed emphasis on the possibility of nuclear use. We saw it first with the change in Russia's nuclear doctrine and the emphasis by Putin and other senior Russian officials about the possibility of nuclear use in different circumstances. We're going to see it again in the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review, which will be coming out at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, which I believe is likely to loosen the language about under what conditions the U.S. Might use nuclear weapons. I don't know that for sure, but there's been rumors in the press that that's likely to happen. Of course, none of the nuclear weapon states or countries protected by nuclear umbrellas have signed this treaty. But I would point out that many important nuclear arms control agreements have often begun without key state signature or ratification. The NPT itself was signed without the participation of France and China, two nuclear weapon states at the time. The Treaty of Tlatelolco, which created the nuclear weapon-free zone in Latin America, was started by Mexico virtually single-handedly. The two civil nuclear powers in the region, Brazil and Argentina, had nothing to do with it. Cuba would have nothing to do with it. But now all countries in the hemisphere, or in Latin America, are party to the treaty, and all the 5 declared nuclear weapon states, members of the NPT, have signed protocols stating that they will adhere to the terms of the treaty as well. And now we begin to see nuclear weapon-free zones spreading to other parts of the southern hemisphere, and hopefully will gain adherence as well. And even if they don't go into effect, treaties have the effect of censoring certain conduct, and I'm thinking particularly of the comprehensive nuclear test ban. It's been around, I don't know now, 20 years, 25 years? And nuclear tests are considered very bad behavior, as seen by the willingness of all nations of the world to condemn the North Korean nuclear tests. Would this happen if other countries were testing nuclear weapons? I don't think so. So the CTBT, although not in effect and not ratified by key countries like the US and China, has had a positive effect in terms of creating the sense that certain kinds of behavior, nuclear testing, is not a legitimate form of national behavior. So the nuclear ban, if it does gain widespread adherence, and even if the nuclear weapon states stay out of it, it could have a similar effect of pushing nuclear weapons and anything to do with nuclear weapons further from the outside the boundaries of legitimate national behavior. Now, I'd certainly agree much could be done to improve the treaty, and much could be done to promote adherence to it by other countries. The opportunity to begin that will be at the General Assembly high-level conference in May, and we might discuss here and in other forums what like-minded people in the U.S. and in other countries could do to promote kind of constructive actions at that high-level conference.
No, I appreciate that because, I mean, you and I were talking about the landmine treaty and other things where it was a grassroots effort that took some doing in order to have anything happen. And as you point out in the Treaty of Tlatelolco, it's a gradual process. And so let's go forward. Speaking of going forward, you have been working, Jim, with George Shultz, I guess, for a period of time, and others on one path forward potentially to try to get us to a nuclear-free world. Could you give us a little bit of background on that? I know you had done a book with Schultz, edited. Okay. The war that must never
be fought.
Yeah. Okay, well, and that was like a year or so ago. So do you want to, why don't you tell us what's going on there?
Okay. Well, I think a lot of you may remember a period about 10 years ago, 2007, when what we call the Gang of Four, or the Four Horsemen, meaning George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn, began to write a series of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal. And it was startling because these four men were veterans of the Cold War, I think known as hardliners in general, and yet they came out together for a world without nuclear weapons. They were advocating the elimination of nuclear weapons. And that made a huge impression, not only in this country, but overseas as well. The excitement I remember very vividly. I was with George Shultz at that time, and we began to think that something actually might happen, because people began to talk about that. There was a real spirit of something that could be done. We were encouraged also when President Obama came into office and gave a speech in which he endorsed this idea of a world without a nuclear weapon. Gave a speech in Prague and listed a number of issues that need to be addressed urgently. And here we are now complaining about nothing much is happening. Now, I don't know why that is exactly, except that people are of the view that deterrence, that very first cartoon that was put up there sort of tells the story. People think that nuclear deterrence has saved us, that it ended World War II and has saved us ever since, and therefore don't tinker with something that works. I think that's the basic problem. And in this book, The War That Must Never Be Fought, Schultz and I edited it. It came out in 2015, and we challenged that issue, that assumption that nuclear deterrence is something that always works and has saved us from disaster. There's a lot more to it than that. It was in 2013 that the last of the 5 op-eds written by the Gang of Four appeared in the Wall Street Journal. So it's been quite a while since we've heard from these gentlemen collectively. But one of the messages they tried to convey from the very beginning was that there is a need for a new institution, something that they called a joint enterprise. In the very first op-ed that they produced in January of 2007, they identified it as a joint enterprise of nations, leaders of nations, because they emphasized summit meetings from the very beginning as a way to advance nuclear disarmament. But they talked about a joint enterprise of those nations that possessed nuclear weapons. They were thinking about something like the P5 or all of the nuclear weapon states. And it's interesting if you track what they said about the joint enterprise idea from 2007 to their very last op-ed in 2013, they went through a kind of a learning process. They dropped the idea that this joint enterprise should be limited just to nuclear weapon states, and they began to talk about it in a much more nuanced way. I brought along this op-ed of the 2013. I'd like to read a little passage from it. It says, "We also need a new dialogue. The U.S. must work with other key states to establish a joint enterprise with common objectives to achieve near-term results. Russia and the U.S., with the largest nuclear stockpiles, have a special responsibility in this regard." And it gets operational now. They call this a coalition of the willing. The nuclear security summits could provide a model for leaders working together to create a joint enterprise that would generate a coalition of willing states to establish priorities and achieve progress on specific steps. Essential subjects should be identified in which many nations have a stake and to which many must make a contribution, so no longer the emphasis on just the nuclear weapon states. A timetable for meetings between heads of government and would help to build diplomatic structures for engagement within which foreign ministers, defense ministers, and others can work together between the meetings of government leaders. So there you have it. It's one paragraph that basically describes what they hoped could be done. So far as I know, nobody ever picked that up. There was no ICANN to advance this idea at all. And this is the last attempt they made jointly to try to get a new dialogue going. Now, a couple of years after their last op-ed, Schultz and I produced this book, and chapter 15 of it is a rather detailed extrapolation of what this one paragraph said. So any of you who would like to look at the details of how we might move ahead can read chapter 15 and get probably more information than you need or want. And what I think needs to be done now is to essentially interest other nations in this project. The U.S. and Russia cannot do this alone. In fact, there's no great inclination on the part of the U.S. and Russia to do this alone at the moment, I don't think, for good or bad. But now that there is a ban treaty in existence, it's possible that this old idea, which predates the ban treaty by several years, could be revived. I'd like to see it revived. I think that it does answers the needs for a new way of approaching arms control, because the old methods simply are not working. There is no system that we have in place now that effectively negotiates nuclear disarmament. The Geneva Conference has been moribund for years. The U.S.-Russia forum, which needs to be expanded in any case, is not working. So a new system is needed. And what better way of doing this than to do exactly what Mallory was just talking about, namely to try to get a group of countries together, 20 or 30, and to try to have a discussion about how one might proceed. This is a much more complicated story than just say eliminate nuclear weapons. The Gang of Four, I suspect, feel that they learned that lesson because they advocated it strongly, and they came up with all kinds of ideas as to why that was a good thing to do. Nothing ever happened. So what I'm arguing is that this idea now needs to be revived, that a group of countries who have an interest perhaps in the ban treaty, but certainly in trying to reduce the nuclear threat, needs to promote the idea of a new forum for discussing nuclear disarmament. Who those countries are, I leave to those people interested in the subject, but I should think clearly it would be some of the nuclear weapon states. I would hope all of them, including the newer ones. And I believe that we need to get countries that have abandoned nuclear weapons like South Africa to be involved. So I think that's a practical way of proceeding. We have a lot of things that need to be done. And we have in the nuclear security summits, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, a model which I think actually did work pretty well. They came up with a general communique once the heads of government met, which said what their general aim was. In this case, I would think our general aim would be a world without nuclear weapons. And they came up with a work plan, and this could be done in this case as well. And then they came up with a whole list of ideas that could be done unilaterally, that is to say, without any agreement at all. I think all of those methods are probably going to have to be deployed because we have regional issues where a global instrument is not really necessarily the best way of doing it. You have a lot of issues that have to do with what I call ancillary problems like the INF Treaty, which is probably a U.S.-Russia problem, and so forth. So you have to have a flexible means of addressing all of these issues, but the key here is to make sure this happens at the leadership level. You cannot do anything in this area, I think, unless you have leaders of the countries involved taking a personal interest. And the idea that was developed through the nuclear security summits, I think, is the right way of going at it. We should have something that says leaders are responsible for this kind of issue. Can't be done at a lower level than this and be successful. And you have to have some kind of sustained efforts. So it's not a one-shot deal. You have to have a summit meeting that says, okay, we're going to meet again in a couple of years. In the meantime, we're going to set up machinery to do these things that we all agree should be done. So that would be my approach to this. It may be that this is the answer to the question of what do you do next. In any case, it's an idea that we've been pushing now for many years, and I think perhaps the time has come to take a serious look at it for a change.
I mean, and this is the trend, as you point out, in the nuclear security summits. They have the gift baskets and they have the house gifts. So you say, here's what I'm willing to do. And I can actually see this potentially happening. It's interesting what you bring up about leadership. If you're looking for leadership, unfortunately, we look at who might want to do this. Several years ago, Putin had suggested multilateral negotiations, that arms control agreements going forward should not just be U.S. Russia. You know, that just went by the by. Nothing happened there, and the world has changed a lot since then. So what I found really interesting is that the Netherlands Parliament was the one that forced the Netherlands, as we were talking about, to participate in this ban treaty discussion. So here we've got broader civil society. We've got a different part of government forcing the leadership, which is reluctant. It's not going to happen in the U.S. case necessarily, but in certain cases to participate in something. And in the UK, which didn't participate in the Nuke ban treaty, I saw a poll that 75% of those polled wanted the UK to participate in the discussions. And they didn't necessarily want to give up their weapons. That wasn't what they were voting for. They said participate in the discussions. And if they didn't, but. So looking to the Proliferation Security Initiative, other things that have started by coalitions of the willing, and also thinking about taking leadership not just at the executive level, but parliamentary levels too. Civil society, ICANN, right? I think you're very on top of things, ways we might go in the future. And this is why I also wanted, when we're talking about innovative new ways forward, we have to think differently. The world has changed, obviously. And when I think about proliferation issues, I worry about North Korea as a failing state selling its fissile material and to terrorists, and then what? So one of the things I worked on at Harvard was nuclear forensics and attribution. And if you could be held liable for what your material does, maybe you don't want to have material anymore. Maybe the cost-benefit analysis of even having this stuff changes. Could there be a tax on this? I mean, these are all kind of out-of-the-box ideas, which is why we have Simi Payne here. She's a specialist in environmental and humanitarian law. And I want to look at some of the historic cases of liability and compensation claims. And you wrote several chapters in a new book, Environmental Protection and Transitions from Conflict to Peace, Clarifying Norms, Principles, and Practices. And in it, you discussed the UN Compensation Commission that was set up after the first Gulf War. And I know we recognize that the low levels of a lot of these claims are not going to deter a state necessarily from using or developing nuclear weapons. But, if we can establish norms for future claims, even in domestic legislation, I mean, there's a potential cost-benefit analysis when you make the choice to develop weapons or to use them that could perhaps change the way, at least at the TACNUC level. So could you give us a little background on because I know very little about environmental compensation claims, and give us a short tutorial. We appreciate that.
Okay. Well, I think the basic rule is you broke it, you pay for it. That's liability and compensation.
Okay.
Then how that actually plays out in this context becomes complicated. I think most people don't realize that there actually has been substantial, in the billions of dollars, compensation paid for just environmental damage from armed conflict relatively recently. So I can describe a little bit of the UN Compensation Commission. I think for these purposes, you're right, that the context is maybe tactical nuclear exchanges, maybe loss of control of materials. And so that's what we should be thinking of. Obviously, a major exchange of nuclear weapons, people are not going to be thinking too much about compensation in that context. But even with a limited exchange of weapons, my Rutgers University colleague, Alan Roebuck, who has studied nuclear winter and was one of the scientists who developed the underlying research there, has also recently looked at the potential global impacts of even an exchange, say, between India and Pakistan that's relatively limited, and found that the consequences would be severe and would be global. So we might be talking about extremely large-scale damages of various kinds. So looking at liability and compensation, there's a few things that it can do besides just change the financial cost and benefit. One is it can impose real financial costs. It can be a process that going through claims can create a record of what the harm is. So that can be very useful. And it's actually instructive to look at the cases that we have as an historic matter. The UN Compensation Commission, which Deborah just mentioned, was set up in the follow-up to the 1990-91 Gulf War. So Iraq invaded Kuwait. There were repeated calls from the UN Security Council for Iraq to withdraw, and statements that Iraq was liable as a matter of state responsibility, as a violation of the UN Charter, for the damage that it caused. At the end of the war, the ceasefire agreement that Iraq agreed to included a measure for compensation, and the UN Compensation Commission was established to deal with that. There were 2.7 million claims. The huge number is partly because there were a lot of individual claims by individual people, as well as government claims, and they included claims for environmental damage. The claims had an asserted value of $352 billion, and so that was enormous. The total compensation that was awarded was actually $52 billion, a little more than that, and about 10% of that was awarded for environmental damage and general public health damage. So that gives you an idea of what a limited war with conventional weapons in a very small geographic area might cost, and you can look at the awards and see the kinds of harms that are detailed there, and then that might help your imagination in thinking about what nuclear might do. So I think what that tells us is that you can have a legal process, you can create jurisdiction through a method such as a Security Council resolution, which has legally binding effect on parties to the UN Charter. The jurisdiction is extremely difficult to establish in other contexts, and that's one of the questions that you'd raised, Deborah, in our previous conversations, that how do you actually create a forum for this kind of a legal process? That is challenging. And in fact, it's unusual to have any kind of compensation like this. Certainly we know things like the Versailles Treaty, right, establishes compensation. We've had other post-conflict fora like this. But generally, what we see is ex gratia payments from one government to the other. You don't see payments to individuals, for instance, although the UN Compensation Commission did that. So I was thinking about specifically where if we had armed conflict and use of nuclear weapons. Well, US-Japan, and there was no compensation paid. It was in fact part of the ceasefire agreement the truce agreement that at the end of the war that there'd be no compensation paid. What about the US and Vietnam? Not nuclear, but armed conflict. No compensation was formally paid through a liability and compensation construct. The US has, however, done about $100 million in compensation informally.
Yeah, without admitting liability.
Without admitting liability. The Palomares accident was a B-52 that crashed with its fuel supply plane, and the nuclear weapons that were on the B-52 came to Earth in Spain, and a couple of them exploded. It was sort of like a dirty bomb. And again, that's the kind of thing that might happen, might come within the ambit. I think of what you're talking about. There was, again, informal between U.S. and Spain, payment of money and removal of contaminated soil. And I understand there's ongoing remediation that's taking place, even though this took place a long time ago. So that is more typically the context. It's difficult, and also it maybe gives you the scale of the kind of money that we're talking about.
That's historically, though. So what I was thinking about was, I don't know if anybody read the New York Times Magazine about was it last weekend or the weekend before, about the Coast Guard taking a more broader role and how they're basically taking people who they capture in free waters and considering it that they have caused harm by transporting drugs. And this is taking U.S. domestic legislation. So they started doing this, and then they decided, we probably need a law to do this domestically, and said that you are subject, even though you're in international waters, to U.S. law because you're harming us by having this type of material, these narcotics. Why couldn't these 122 countries say, hey, you're harming us by transporting over the seas or something? And, well, obviously, there's a lot of problems with this. But I was thinking about the fact that domestic law extends beyond itself, beyond its own borders. And in talking to another one of your colleagues, we were discussing about the impact of making a claim domestically in terms of contributing to norms and allowing you to take actions. So could you give me a little bit of background on how that works legally?
So this is a great question, and it's something that's evolving, especially in the notion of what you can do on the high seas. There's another example I'll give, which was a pirate fishing ship that was fishing illegally. So under international law and international policy that's widely agreed, this ship was doing something illegal. And I think you could say the same thing about the drug running. It's not something that is normally considered legal under international law, and you can make an arguable case under treaty and customary international law that there would be jurisdiction. And then it's enormously helpful to have domestic law. Now this is where it gets interesting. I think, as Barry said, one of the values of this treaty is that it develops norms. It reinforces the taboo. And so any action that's taken, even if it is semi-symbolic, might contribute to that, okay? So if countries do adopt domestic law that's consistent with the international law and the overall jurisdictional requirements, then they're adding to that taboo. They're reinforcing it. They're restating what they've already committed to in the treaty and becoming a party to the treaty. It also means that, although it may be a small number of circumstances where something like that could be deployed, maybe it is a loss of control of materials, that then there can be an arrest on the high seas. Who knows? It would give the potential for enforcement, which would be a good thing. That would actually concretely advance the agenda. And I think there's one thing that needs to be considered, which is this notion of universal jurisdiction. And that would be the limitation on the parties to the treaty trying to impose treaty obligations on the current nuclear weapons states. There's so far been, in other cases that aren't related to this particular issue, blocks to universal jurisdiction that's exercised in that way. So that there'd be some barriers there. So it would have to be, that kind of domestic legislation would have to be very carefully constructed. But I could see that there's a potential role for something that would be useful.
Because usually you have to have an actual harm affected. You have to have something blow up. But I really liked your example of the piracy and the drug running. It's like, you don't necessarily have the harm already occurred. You're saying that this is a recognized harm. So trading in nuclear weapons or nuclear materials could be considered like that. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is former head of the State Department's Policy Planning Group, she had put forth an idea of having any possession of nuclear material out of state control a crime against humanity. And especially now when you look at who's captured with fissile material, or maybe even small grams of it, you may get 12 months in prison in Moldova. I mean, like, what does that say in terms of deterrence theory? So I'm liking the idea of going down to being responsible for your material and locking it down, and maybe having a special prosecutor from the Southern District of New York who's really aggressive. I don't know. But I mean, I'm just trying to think of new ideas of ways to take this forward beyond like the Laura Rockwood Thomas Shea, with great piece on verification and the Trilateral Initiative, which is also another way on verification that needs to go forward, but just new ways to get at this. But go ahead, Jim.
There are a couple of initiatives that were taken during the Bush administration, second Bush administration, which are linked to the UN. I don't have the exact names of them, but one has to do with nuclear smuggling. I think it's called a Program for Nuclear Security or something of that type.
Oh, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism.
Yeah, that's one of them. There's a couple more. And this idea, I would think, would fit very nicely into those kinds of programs, where there probably should be some kind of a fine in those cases.
Yeah, they very much kept civil society out of it. I mean, I've tried to get more information informally, too, about how some of those things. So we'll have to talk later about.
Should be able to get it from the UN.
Well, yeah, if it's through the new, and we do work with the UN 1540 committee, so have worked on that. The other thing I was looking at is, I want to look at how do you increase the benefits of not developing or further investing in nuclear weapons development, and not just verification for bringing it down or perfecting a treaty. So just having to change the cost-benefit analysis. And we've talked about some of the negatives and the liability, but I found it interesting that North and South Korea women's sports teams have been cooperating this year. It's like, this is ping-pong diplomacy, right? A women's soccer tournament in Pyongyang and a women's hockey competition in South Korea happened. And so I think another way to think through this is how do we, I guess, Sister Mallory, you were talking about how can we find areas to cooperate. It doesn't only have to be in the nuclear realm, but just building good relationships and peace at lower levels. The South Korean president had invited North Korea, this was before the last missile test, said, could we use your mountains for some of the Olympics in North Korea, and could we have them in North Korea? I thought, wow, that was bold, even after all the nuclear tests, but this was, I don't think anything is happening with that. But I know we're going to, did you want to say something before we go on? I want to open it to the audience.
We could let the Russian team compete up there.
Well, I did have a quick comment on something that Mallory said, which I thought was really pertinent, which is you highlighted how, what I would say is how siloed these different bodies of law are. When you pointed out that the lack of enforcement of the chemical weapons ban is undermining. And I think, so the field in which I've chiefly worked excludes nuclear entirely, which is conventional armed conflict and the protection of the environment in that context. So making it clear that chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, conventional weapons are all one thing, and sort of pressing against this silo that's being created, which has limited the reach of international humanitarian law also in this realm. And I'd also be curious if other people on the panel have.
I did want to say something about the chemical treaty. Stimson has a vested interest in it. It was the one time we ever registered as lobbyists to work for ratification of the treaty. But I think the treaty's been a great success despite the Syrian use. I mean, huge stocks of chemical weapons have been verifiably destroyed. And yes, Syria was not condemned by the UN, but only because of the Russian veto. So, it was an exception. It was an instance of cheating, and there, no doubt, North Korea cheats on it, and probably others. But on the whole, I'd say it was a successful treaty.
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping to talk about that a little bit because the concern I have in equating the ban treaty with the Chemical Weapons Convention is that it misses one of the major concerns that I have about the ban treaty is that it has different levels of verification and different status depending on whether you have nuclear weapons or you don't, or you had them at one time. The Chemical Weapons Convention is an even application. Everyone is subject to the same verification regime. In the ban treaty, clearly there's differences. And while it's an acknowledged problem in the treaty, I worry that pushing that relationship forward, keeping a sort of a division in these communities is not productive to an ultimate sort of equitable verification and complete prohibition regime like the Chemical Weapons Convention was successful with, at least comparatively successful until Russia blocks accountability under it. But I wanted to say that the ban treaty proponents, I think, should be careful in merging these concepts of customary international law and international norm development under this treaty, because it has certainly solidified the taboo that non-nuclear weapon states feel about nuclear weapons. Certainly, it represents their position that they've actively advocated throughout all the NPT review conferences and for many years. But it can't change the existence of the NPT, right, that allows nuclear weapon states to have nuclear weapons. And it also recognizes, the importance of nuclear security for nonproliferation, to actually engage in peaceful nuclear uses. It has recognized reasons why there could be transfer of nuclear material, why there could be assistance from non-nuclear weapon states in nuclear security and risk prevention analysis. And I just worry that if we argue that the ban treaty, by its mere existence, pushes forward customary international law, I don't think that's accurate. I think it could solidify civil society's push towards greater outrage with nuclear weapons generally, but I don't think it can change the existence of the NPT or supplant some of the work that the ICJ has done in establishing the need for opinio juris and the fact that there needs to be a customary basis for not doing something versus a treaty basis. And certainly the ban treaty and the weapons-free zones and even the prohibitions on non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT demonstrate when you don't have nuclear weapons, it's because of a treaty basis, not a customary international law basis. Going to the civil society norms, I also worry that certainly democratic societies such as the US and France and the UK are going to be subject to greater civil society pressure than Russia and China. And in any context of a ban discussion, when you don't have all the nuclear weapon states involved, you risk not having a very positive or actually practically possible prohibition. Because if there are nuclear weapon states that are allowed to have their nuclear weapons under the NPT, and there's non-nuclear weapon states that are in the treaty, the ban treaty, under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Article 30, the NPT governs those relationships, right? A later in time treaty on the same topic, essentially, will only be effective as between parties to that treaty. But if you have an earlier in time treaty, such as the NPT on the same topic, the ban treaty parties still have to adhere to the NPT when they're engaging with Russia and China. So it just seems hard to push this narrative forward.
It's complex when you take it in the legal framework.
Right, and the legal framework confuses it. And anytime you kind of say legal norms and sort of civil society norms and merge them, you risk muddling a conversation that I think is a difficult one to parse through. And certainly the fact that Russia and China don't experience the same pressure as the other nuclear weapon states or even on the umbrella states is going to be a hard one to approach if we continue in the ban treaty advocates' approach of the haves versus the have-nots. I think only with a collaborative conversation, maybe combining silos or eliminating silos, trying to approach this collectively, can we push beyond the divide that this treaty still represents and the Chemical Weapons Convention doesn't represent.
But just to push back a little, one of the areas that Stimson is working at on the civil nuclear side is developing a system of due cares and governance over civil nuclear facilities, and thereby even defining some agreed norms among a small group of players is helping to establish that for liability more broadly. So, it's a long process.
Yes, and I don't disagree that this is part of the norms conversation, certainly. And as this discussion moves forward, the ban treaty can at least bring the conversation to light and try to resolve some of these issues. And that's why I'm not anti the fact that this ban treaty happened. I just don't want people to stop at this ban treaty. I don't want the next review conference to be ban treaty proponents versus all other states, and that's the positions they take. Because if that is the process, it won't allow forward progress, because that has been the process in previous NPT review conferences, the haves versus the have-nots, and they can't come together in any way.
Well, and one of the things I want to develop, maybe in the conversation that we'll shortly have, is one of the things that you said, Barry, the UN High-Level Conference on Nuclear Disarmament in May. Let's try to surface not only these existing ideas, but let's look at some more innovative things, like I'd mentioned the international fissile material tax, and how might this work? Or you're saying taking things out of the conference on disarmament, like a fissile material control treaty, make that a coalition of the willing, potentially, who will help develop something like that. One thing I was entranced with was the World Bank's its new bond finance facility for pandemics, which is an automatic payment to work against pandemics and biological effects so that you can have immediate response. Well, what if we could commit, states who are interested could commit to automatically levying severe sanctions on countries that might first use nuclear weapons, such as sports, travel, trade bans, and have financing solutions so that the penalties to them are not high, so that they can affect this without severe cost, maybe through a risk bond like the pandemic bond, or deny visas to workers. The UAE just started denying North Korean worker visas, and they've got like 2,000 workers there, and they've got 20,000 overall people working on developing their nuclear power plants. So just having some of these automatic sanctions that you know will happen to you if you do X could be some way to develop. But let me open it up to the audience now, and I thank the panelists. And when you have a question, if you could state your name and make it a question, and if you want to direct it to a particular member, that's fine.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Stimson, for putting this together. I'm Darrell Kimball with the Arms Control Association, and we've been looking at the Prohibition Treaty process for quite a while and studied the text and participated in the negotiations. And I just wanted to point out a couple things that are missing from the conversation here. And this is particularly in response to Mallory's analysis. I think in addition to actually just looking at the text, it's important to understand the genesis of the initiative, what led the negotiators to this point, and also to look at the negotiators' vision of what this was and what it wasn't. And I think that leads you to a different set of conclusions than you drew, Mallory. And I think the key point that I would just add that's missing here is that the states that pursued the humanitarian initiative with humanitarian conferences were frustrated with the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament, as Barry pointed out. They were also looking for ways to fill what they called the legal gap in the NPT, which is that it doesn't prohibit nuclear weapons. That was the fundamental goal. This is not and wasn't intended to be the equivalent of the CWC. So I think it's unfair and unreasonable to compare it to the CWC because this was not a nuclear weapons convention. It's a ban. So I think one needs to understand it in that context. The other thing I would just point out, and I disagree strenuously, Mallory, with the way you're characterizing the ban treaty and the proponents as accentuating the divides. I mean, the ban treaty is not the problem. The ban treaty is a symptom of a problem that's been around, and the problem is that the nuclear weapon states are not pursuing their disarmament commitments on a pace that the rest of the world expects. And there are serial non-compliant countries within the NPT system. So the final thing I would just say that's missing from the conversation is if you look at the negotiating records and you listen to what the states said and you look at other parts of the treaty is very much meant to complement the NPT, not replace. And where there is an apparent conflict, maybe on things like the additional protocol, there are reasons, there are explanations as to why the negotiators wound up at that point. They're actually very similar to the problems in the negotiations at the NPT review conferences about the additional protocol. So I just find it's important to look at the treaty from the perspective of the history, the negotiations themselves, and the intentions of the negotiators.
Thank you so much, Darrell. I certainly agree that the intent of the negotiators and the ban treaty proponents is a good one, right? It's to address something that hasn't been actually effectively done before and try to push the conversation forward. But you mentioned, well, also I completely agree that the ban treaty and the CWC should not be equated in any way. I just mentioned that because sometimes they are. They have similar provisions. There was some underlying sort of efforts to use some of the models from the CWC. I think saying that the ban treaty is a symptom of an underlying problem is exactly what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that the ban treaty is making the divide. I'm just saying the ban treaty continues, unfortunately, an inconsistency between the trust level for non-nuclear weapon states that they have for themselves and what they have for nuclear weapon states. This additional protocol problem, which I agree was a negotiated problem, and I was not involved in the negotiations in any way, of course, but I have read sort of the background that suggests it was a problem, that they didn't have the time necessarily, or they had some other issues with getting the additional protocol uniformly required across the board. I think it can continue a different status between these countries, and that's what I think we should try to avoid moving forward. But I certainly don't mean to criticize the negotiators of the treaty, nor do I mean to criticize the impetus for it and the need for it and the instincts behind it. I think all of us, again, want a world without nuclear weapons, and how we get there is certainly up for debate. And with this treaty, we can have a more fulsome conversation if we can get the nuclear weapon states to engage and discuss. My concern is that if this treaty is used for the non-nuclear weapon states to hide behind, or at least to say, join this and we'll start having a conversation, that would be problematic, because I think the legal parameters make it difficult for any nuclear weapon state to join, especially if they don't join as a bunch, as a whole. And I think the verification withdrawal provisions would make it practically impossible for some democratic communities and societies to actually adhere to this without risking national security. So I certainly don't mean to imply that I was anti the negotiators, or that I think the ban treaty itself creates a problem. I do agree with you, it's a symptom of the problem. And that hopefully is something that collectively the countries that have nuclear weapon states and don't have nuclear weapon states can actually remedy in productively talking about this together.
I had a legal question here. So in reading this ban treaty, I see that this was one of the few treaties I've read that the articles of the treaty shall not be subject to reservations. I mean, most treaties I've read, you're allowed to have reservations to. And since this treaty can be amended, what about one thing to do is offer an amendment that you could be subject to reservations, then you can have more people sign on, and then you can have potentially a nuclear weapon country say that I will comply with this if other countries sign on to additional protocols as part of their safeguards agreement. I mean, it's very broad, but at least it's,
Yeah.
I guess it's useful to know that environmental treaties usually do not allow reservations.
Oh, they don't.
Human rights treaties usually do. So
Oh,
there's
really?
two strategies. The human rights strategy is to say you can have a Swiss cheese treaty because there are so many reservations.
Right.
But people will be meeting, and you'll be, again, it's about a theory of norm development
right.
and norm transfer. There's been some criticism of that. Ryan Goodman's written about this, saying that the problem is it can go the other way. You can actually degrade the norm by allowing that. So that's certainly one of the cautions about it.
Okay.
It's
I appreciate
a bigger
that.
question.
Yeah. Then a quick.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. And in the arms control field, there are treaties that have no reservations, exactly because if you take a reservation to a provision, then under the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, that operative provision drops out as between you and the other parties.
Right.
And so I think in this context, they didn't want to allow reservations so that none of the
I see.
fundamental prohibitions could be accepted in any way. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me go over here.
Hi. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Good. It's Stephanie Cook with Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, and I really appreciated this. This is a fabulous forum, and it's really encouraging to hear people in this country speak in this way about disarmament and the hope for disarmament still, because I was concerned earlier this year to hear Chris Ford at Carnegie say that he questioned whether disarmament should be our ultimate goal. But that aside for the moment, I'm a little confused about how this treaty complements the NPT. I understand it in certain respects, but I think there's a huge fear in Vienna, people involved in the NPT review conference coming up, that there's going to be a slugfest over Article 6 in the NPT. I mean, the ban treaty and Article 6, to my mind, are kind of diametrically opposed, and the good thing about this treaty is that it puts it up there in broad lights now, and there is going to have to be, or hopefully there will be over the years, some kind of coming together over this, and how you do it, I don't know, that's for you experts to figure out, but you know, the fact that this treaty can be amended is hopeful. I was going to ask one thing, is the NPT amendable, number one, and number two, I was very interested in Simi's talk about costs. Has there been any calculation, for example, on the reparations for the Marshall Islands and for the reparations that the UK, France, any other country may have had to pay for just nuclear testing? And can that be part of an eventual, you know, dialogue in this thing, just letting people know about the costs to society, and not just environmentally, but the cost to people involved in weapons programs? So there's a great book on that, Killing Your Own. But anyway, sorry, so I've thrown out quite a bit in a disparate way, but.
Why don't we start with the easy one? Well, not so easy, Marshall Islands.
Really easy. So the Marshall Islands actually became, so it was within the trusteeship program when the U.S. did nuclear testing there. Caused serious damage, irradiation of islands, Bikini, the famous source of the bathing suit, and but serious public health damage, and actually vaporized some small islands. So the U.S. settled the claims that came in U.S. courts. U.S.
Okay.
court claims. They settled them by setting up the Nuclear Claims Tribunal for the Marshall Islands and funded it with $150 million, which was meant to be invested so that it would generate over the time period of the claims review more money. That sort of didn't work out great. The final claims review ended up with I think it's around $3 billion of outstanding claims. And the most recent thing I saw was a bill that Jeff Bingaman had presented to try to get supplementary funds in 2010, and that was rejected. There may have been more recent efforts. They keep trying, the Marshall Islands keeps trying to get more funding, but they haven't been able to. So that's the Marshall Islands story. There are some other sort of incidents, what happened with U.S. civilians in testing, where there was some funding. Let's see, I'm trying to think of others. There's been some variation in that, and a lot of complaints that the U.S. actually, provided more funding for its own citizens than it did for people outside the U.S. who were affected. Again, the UK has been criticized for not providing funding for people harmed by testing.
And there was a Soviet satellite, a Russian satellite, that over Canada.
Yeah. So that one
blew up and scattered radiation everywhere.
Yeah. So that was a non-military use,
right?
Where that came down. And Canada spent about $6 million. Russia and asked for less than that, and Russia agreed to pay about $3 million, I think, which was substantially less than Canada had asked for. So, and Chernobyl, of course, the Chernobyl accident, there were no claims against the Soviets for that, although there were programs set up internally in Ukraine and Belarus to provide some compensation.
And a couple other things. Just recently there was a class action lawsuit against GE for Fukushima.
There's 3 of them we're doing.
Oh, good. Good. I can't wait to read that.
That's a really important.
Yeah, so, this is where I'm saying using courts. Yeah. And that's civil, and Japan was not a member of any international treaties at the time.
Well, it hadn't gone into effect the CSC.
Yeah, that's until afterwards, so therefore the claims can be open. But Oh, I would love it. And then your question about the NPT, is there any?
I wanted to
Okay, please.
comment on that. It's not the ban treaty that's going to cause the trouble at the conference. It's the fact that all the nuclear weapon states are modernizing and in some cases expanding their nuclear arsenals rather than working to reduce the role of nuclear weapons.
I'm not saying that, but that's how it's phrased when you talk to people. They look at them as sort of, upstart troublemakers.
Well, that's how governments and nuclear weapon states look at it, but right.
And I didn't see that. I have the NPT here, and I don't think that there's any reservations allowed. Looking at it. Well, I mean, yeah. I'm sorry.
The amendment provision.
Oh, the amendment provision. I'll have to read it more clearly. Get back to you. Or we all can read this. Okay.
We have a question from someone online.
Okay.
So this is exciting. They'd like to know if we could flesh out what we mean by ban a little bit more. Are we talking about weapons, delivery systems, devices, materials? What?
Unfortunately, it's not defined very clearly. Do you want to talk to that, Mallory?
I mean, it's just the production, the development, test, production, manufacture, otherwise acquire, possess, or stockpile nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. That's sort of the operative provision in the prohibitions. While we haven't really defined those terms before, we basically have a sense of them from the NPT and others, and I think that was basically what the negotiators were thinking, that we use the going perception of what they're talking about. But it's a question that reflects a lot of the work that has to be done with respect to this treaty to understand how these prohibitions are going to be applied in a world that includes the NPT, right? Where you do have peaceful nuclear cooperation, you do have nuclear security cooperation and risk cooperation. You need to understand how this will work if there's no assistance, encouragement, and inducement for anything that's prohibited to these states parties.
There was a lot. Let me take a couple of questions. These two here.
Thanks. I'm Heather Williams from King's College London. According to the ban supporters, the ban treaty isn't necessarily about the elimination of weapons. Rather, it's about changing the way that we talk about them. And with that in mind, the ban treaty has actually been successful. We're having a panel. We've probably all gone to lots of panels about this. And having participated in all the humanitarian conferences, that narrative is very compelling. And I think it's good to see that this humanitarian narrative is getting this type of attention. At the same time, for a lot of ban skeptics, I think what they really struggle with is making this link between normative change and seeing substantive change, tangible progress, if you are serious about elimination. So what I just want to very quickly put out 3 propositions for you of if you think any of these might be likely in terms of how the ban normative change translates into actual working towards elimination. So the first would be, is it going to be unilateral change, such as in the US or the UK, where you see changes in declaratory policy or domestic law? Is it going to be multilateral reductions, such as Ambassador Goodby has outlined, in which case you're going to need to see public pressure in places like Russia and China? Or the last one, is it going to be pursuing additional normative and legal changes, such as revisiting the 1996 ICJ advisory opinion? And just tagging on to the end of that, because it kind of carries on from those 3 propositions, if you were advising ICANN, how would you advise them to spend their $1 million of the Nobel Peace Prize money?
Okay, and let's take one other question here.
Nick Kyriakopoulos, George Washington University. The impression one gets by listening to the panel is that this treaty is like the end of the rainbow. It's a nice place to go, but getting there has problems. And it seems to me that a more practical way to do it is to see if you can learn a few steps. Let me give you an idea. We still have states which have not signed the additional protocol, correct? We still have states which, including the US, that have not ratified the test ban treaty. We have 2 cases where the goals are simpler, they are easier to see, yet we cannot get to them. So it seems to me that, yes, it's fine, let's go to this total test ban, but it's nice for some theoretical discussions, we can write some papers, but is there a practical effect? And I'd like to throw to the panel another dimension to that. You mentioned the Chemical Weapons Convention. My proposition is that we'll never have a nuclear test ban unless we have a more effective lethal weapon. Ambassador Goodby and Barry Blechman might remember the negotiations in Geneva for the Chemical Weapons Convention. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had already decided that the chemical stockpiles were useless, most of them were deteriorating, and they still could get themselves to agree until they had a confidence-building measures. I remember I participated in a workshop for the CD at 12A Army Depot where we showed the delegates how we destroy chemical weapons, how we store them. The Soviets opened up the stockpiles for visitors so they could see what they looked like. And after they built this confidence, eventually they said, all right, now we have nuclear weapons, we have tactical nuclear weapons, therefore we don't need chemical weapons. So I'd like to propose to the panel that it's nice to talk about it, but unless we have a better invention, we'll never get there.
I'll take, well, lots of questions here. I'll take the last one. Well, we're now developing cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, so I think EMPs in space, so maybe that unfortunately we'll get there.
I might comment on some of the things as to how ICANN should spend its $1 million. I'd say spend it on trying to mobilize civil populations to put pressure on governments, at least in democratic states, so they begin to move in the right direction. And as to your point and the practical measures, yes, certainly the practical measures are essential. And, you know, in fact, I wrote to President Obama and spoke to others in his government and said, if you really want to eliminate nuclear weapons, every time you visit a foreign nation or a foreign leader comes to Washington, you should have a list of what practical things that country has yet to do. And that should be part of the agenda of the discussion. Of course, he didn't do any of that. But, I mean, you're right. And that you can put out the goal, the end of the rainbow, and in the meantime work on these practical steps. But certainly this administration won't have people to work on those practical steps.
One of the very important things that the Nuclear Security Summits did was to organize a program where countries could come in and say what they're ready to do right now. And that would be part of the plan that we're talking about as well. So it's not aimed only at multilateral nuclear reductions going to zero, but also at what can be done right now, unilaterally if necessary, or perhaps desirably.
I think that answers some of your questions too. Okay, let's take a couple more. And we'll take two again.
I'm Carlton Stoiber. I'm a political cartoonist, but I also chair the International Nuclear Law Association Working Group on Nuclear Security, and I also negotiated the additional protocol when I was in the State Department. My question really is that, in my view, the lack of political interest in the Trump administration, to be very specific, and in other administrations with complete disarmament as envisaged by the treaty, means that it's unlikely to move forward in a near term. My concern is more with nuclear security, nuclear terrorism, and what happens to these arsenals and other nuclear facilities when we're in an era of expanding terrorist activities in many parts of the world. And I'd be interested in the panel's perspective on the relationship between nuclear security and nuclear disarmament in the context of not only this instrument, but other activities that should be conducted by the world's nuclear powers.
And then another question over here.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I'm Jennifer Mackby, FAS, and I wanted to ask Ambassador Goodby if he could expand a little bit on his notion of what they're doing. Is this just an idea, or are you actually proposing to governments that they do this, or would this be conducted on a track 2 level, or how far along is it, and so forth? Thank you.
Want to start with
Well, what we're trying to do, when I say we, I'm talking about a group of us at the Hoover Institution or connected to it, is to make sure that people understand what it is we're talking about. Because despite all of these articles that are written by very important people, nobody has ever heard of this idea. So we're talking with a lot of people around Washington and elsewhere in the think tank world. But also what we would like to do is get governments engaged directly. And by that I mean countries like, say, Mexico, Germany, Japan, countries that have an interest in this subject and want to see something happen. And what I think ideally would happen is that a group of countries come together and decide that they'd like to sponsor some exploration of this particular subject. Set up a preparatory conference to talk about the general idea and how it would work, what the immediate problems should be that need to be dealt with. But above all, try to get the summit level involved, because I'm afraid without that, you just have something after a few years, it gets bureaucratized and disappears.
So, on disarmament, or just on the whole of moving to disarmament?
Well, the idea that I have at least, and I think the others in our group probably would, is that we would declare that to join this club, so to speak, you have to be willing to work together to create the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. Create the conditions means a lot of things, obviously, not just nuclear disarmament, but other things as well. And if you can get people to commit to that and to a model of something like the nuclear security summits, periodic meetings at the summit level, but a lot of work in between time, then I think you get a machinery that really produces results. And without that, I think we're going to be just where we are now, 10 years from now.
Let's go to the other question about the link between nuclear security and disarmament.
And terrorism. I think there are risks of nuclear terrorism, but I think they're generally overblown. I think countries that have nuclear weapons tend to protect them extremely well with very highly qualified people. There could be some corrupt officials that might sell a weapon to a terrorist organization, but I think that's relatively small risk. I think the threat of nuclear terrorism is a useful means of mobilizing publics to be concerned about nuclear weapons. The real risk of nuclear terrorism would be radiation weapons, acquisition of small amounts of nuclear materials.
Okay, I have to disagree with you a little bit on that, but maybe because of my time up at Harvard and some of the guys up there, and not only him, but
2010's passed.
That's true. Thank goodness. But you know, the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism is co-chaired by the Russians and the Americans. So this is one area where we do agree with them, and there's lots of exercises. So at least these two countries think it's significant enough of a problem that it's one area we're going to continue cooperation on. We also had joint démarches, the Americans and the Russians, in order to get the amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material passed, and to say that this is, you know, significant enough that we want to do this. So that tells me, and basically some of the intel people I talked to also told me, that we only know a little bit of the stuff that I knew. So it worries me. I have a fallout shelter. So, okay, let me see. We have time. Yeah, we have time for a couple more questions. Over here and this. Over here.
Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason and Transcend. In terms of creating conditions for eliminating nuclear weapons, one part that's missing is dealing with the underlying conflict and the cause, including the causes of war. So I was at the UN for the ban treaty, and I started an initiative while I was there called Social Scientists for Sanity and Survival. The name's based on the book by Jerome Frank, Sanity and Survival in the Nuclear Age. So just applying knowledge from conflict dynamics and social science and how to reduce tension and address the underlying causes without which we can't. The weapons are just the symptom, and even the humanitarian consequences initiative, which was amazing and very effective. This is the next step. And Deborah, since you announced this wonderful event last week, I'll announce that I'm planning a celebration on Sunday to celebrate the Nobel Peace Prize. And there'll be a workshop before with Johann Galtung, the father of peace studies, on conflict transformation, and then a celebration. And my venue just canceled on me yesterday afternoon, so I'm working on another one, including here. So come up to me if you want.
And you're doing this on Sunday?
Yeah.
Maybe a house of worship would be a good place to.
Yeah, they're all doing bazaars on Sundays in December. But, I have possibility of Street and also just ask the graduates.
Okay, yeah.
I have
Flyers. Yeah, happy to have you pass them out at the end. And there was another question here.
Hi, my name is Tuan Pham from the Carnegie Endowment. My question looks towards the future. So I'm wondering if the deadlock and division and general strife between nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, the umbrella states, and nuclear armed states continues, what are the consequences for the NPT and the global non-proliferation regime in general? And are those consequences acceptable to any of these parties? Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, yes, I so agree with you on the need to address the underlying issues. Why can't we all love each other? John Lennon went there. It's like, I don't know. Bigger issues than I can deal with, but I appreciate that. I was at a meeting, I think it was at GW or maybe at Carnegie, where the question to the panelists was, what can be done about what's going on with North Korea? And the answer was, take 2 pieces of duct tape across 2 people's mouths. And it's like, okay, that's a start. That's a start. Yeah, but you're right. We have to address some of these underlying issues. To the broader questions, do you want to take that one?
I'd just like to say that at the moment we are in a situation where everybody realizes that nothing is happening, and things that are happening are on the side of increasing the levels of nuclear weapons, and delivery systems in particular. And when that's a general outlook that people are expecting, then that makes it almost impossible, I think, to seek cooperation and expect to receive it. So I think changing the dynamics is very important. And you can change the dynamics by having something happen that implies that we are now going to try to really do something seriously for a change. And nothing has been happening. We talked about the nuclear test ban treaty. That was the last result of the conference in Geneva. And that was, as Barry said, 25 years ago, 1986. We need to change the dynamic, and that's the way you get at these underlying issues, I think.
And then the critical stakeholders. I think the question on where to spend the money for ICANN, and you mentioned a couple of countries, Mexico, Germany, and Japan. Not only getting the leadership, but maybe selected parliaments, or as you were talking about, the broader society involved in selected ways. But that's one of the things that we've worked on at Stimson when we try to make change in the civil nuclear area. We've identified, okay, who's a key reinsurer or insurance? Who's going to hurt from this, and how can we engage them? And it's all different levels, and it's taken us a number of years, but I think we finally have movement, at least on this end. But trying to find those proponents who can gain from engagement. Go ahead.
Just say that, of course you're correct. The several people, this fundamental problem is not nuclear weapons or who has nuclear weapons, who's gaining nuclear weapons. It's the underlying political conflicts in the world. The reason 2017 looks so different than 2007 or 2008 is because the renewal of the conflict between Russia and the West, the complete change in that relationship, as well as the worsening of relations in East Asia because of North Korea and because of China's greater assertiveness. I fear we're on the verge of additional proliferation in Asia, maybe not immediately. If the Iran agreement should fail for some reason, we could see further proliferation in the Middle East. But it is the underlying political conflicts, and there will never be disarmament until there is resolution coming to terms of these basic conflicts in world politics.
Can I just add that I think in terms of changing the narrative, which this ban treaty has done to a certain degree, or at least is propagating sort of a broader discussion of this, there has to be also some ability to praise the successes that have happened to advocate for NTI's International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, which we all just call the IPNDV, but to try to celebrate the Nuclear Security Summit, celebrate New START, celebrate the expansion of the nuclear weapon-free zones. Let's try to talk about positive steps that have been made, and you know, worldwide praise those moments. You know, with the JCPOA, push it forward. Don't let politics tear things apart that the entire world supports. And I think that would be a useful narrative for ICANN and others to emphasize, even though, you know, they can continue to push the ban treaty, but at the same time, if they can praise the moments of success and try to analyze why there were opportunities there for success. You know, the IPNDV has a long way to go to sort of more productively encourage success stories, but I think focusing on collaboration and how that leads to a positive result could be a useful narrative if we could really, you know, engage in that process. And I think that may be a useful engagement of civil society.
Well, I think maybe we can end on that positive note. I know that the panelists will be happy to stay after. I think there's some cookies left out there too. And thank you all for coming today. And I want to thank our panelists very much. I think we have a lot of work to do. And hopefully, as Barry said, in preparation for the May UN conference on this, we can put forward some new ideas. So thank you, and thank our panelists.